Hi there, and welcome back to the Climate and Sustainability segment of Techweek 2022. Brought to you by NZ Tech, I'm Leanna and I'm your host for today. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our next panel discussion, which is all about solution or pollution. And here to discuss this is, from the left, we have Nicole Upchurch, CEO of CNZNet. We have Ilan Oshry, Professor of Information Systems and Operational Management at the University of Auckland. Then we have James Cochrane, partner at Stace Hammond, and Dave Roos, founder and CEO of Carbon Click. Welcome, guys. Thanks for taking the time to be with us today and to share with us your knowledge and expertise in this space. Now, Ilan, I believe you've got some exciting news to share with us about a project you've been working on that is actually a world first. Can you tell us a bit about that, please?
Yes, thanks for having us. The Digital Sustainability Index is a project that the Center of Digital Enterprise at the University of Auckland launched last year, and we looked into how enterprises are harnessing digital resources in order to address sustainability challenges. And we studied 195 companies in Asia Pacific, and among them is obviously enterprises here in New Zealand. So the results giving us an indication how well companies are doing in terms of using digital resources in order to address, for example, carbon emission. But at the same time, we got results about New Zealand that didn't place New Zealand as market leader when it comes to sustainability and digital, which means that basically none of the companies that we looked in New Zealand, these are the 11 largest companies in New Zealand, we're actually doing better than companies in 9 countries in Asia Pacific that we have sampled. So obviously this is a little bit concerning for the New Zealand digital landscape, as well as obviously in terms of thinking of sustainability, we would like to do far better than that. When it comes to digital, then in that study we unpack the whole notion of digital by understanding how digital is part of the solution as well as potentially the pollution, and hence this is why we are discussing it here in this forum. So the question is, are we looking at digital as part of the polluting element in the enterprise, or we also can consider it as part of the solution? I do not think that we have made a lot of progress in terms of considering it as part of the solution. I think that there are some progression and some advancements in that regard, and we will hear about that later on from some of the panelists of particular applications that help us track emission, for example. But I think generally speaking, as a country, we can do better, and there is a role here for industry and government to play far more in terms of advancing our understanding, how we can think of any means that is digitally enabled to help us to track, for example, carbon emission. In terms of the solutions then, one of the aspects that I think that we are still struggling with is to understand how we track scope 1, 2, and 3, and just to elaborate a little bit about that. So scope 1 is basically what the enterprise is emitting by operations, and scope 2 would be around the utility that they are consuming, and scope 3, which is actually the most challenging bit, is about understanding what consumers and suppliers are emitting. And so far from conversations that we have had as part of this project, we actually didn't see much progress when it comes to scope 3. And scope 3 is in many industries actually the largest contributor towards carbon emission. So if we haven't tackled that, and we are seeing the government trying to actually give at least the impression that we are moving towards an emission budget, and we are moving towards solutions that will actually reduce emission, but if it is unknown how much we're actually emitting in scope 3, if we haven't measured it, then you haven't solved it. So I'm asking myself, at least as an academic, how far we are on this journey, and how many solutions we have seen that are actually tackling the real problem, without obviously diminishing the massive effort in New Zealand and across Asia Pacific towards solving those issues. So it would be really interesting to hear from the panelists, who are far more knowledgeable than I am about where we are on this journey. But I'm raising those as challenges for the industry. One side aspect of that is blockchain, obviously, and there has been a lot in the media about particular way of mining that are producing basically energy consumption that is obviously needs to be challenged and asked. Obviously, there are now alternatives to that, but the question is, where are we heading with that? And it would be really interesting to hear more about that in terms of whether these are the solutions and these are the direction that we are to see in the coming years.
That is really interesting, and I know New Zealand can put a feather in their hat relating to the reporting of climate disclosures that was legislated late last year and was also a world first, actually. And I understand the External Reporting Board are currently going through a process where they are currently suggesting that companies will be required to report their Scope 3, which may be another world first. I know many other countries suggest that companies report their Scope 3 emissions, but they don't mandate it. So it will be exciting to see where we head in New Zealand. But look, you know, I am a bit concerned, and you mentioned it before, that historically New Zealand's emissions per capita is one of the highest in the world. And that's something, you know, which will put a dent in our clean green, how we're perceived. Do you think New Zealand is harnessing digital solutions to asset and sustainability?
Do I think that New Zealand is harnessing
digital solutions in sustainability?
Yeah, so if I look a little bit more in detail into the Digital Sustainability Index that, as I said, that I believe this is first ever study globally to understand the connection between digital resources and sustainability, then New Zealand in our results came as second degree in terms of its leadership in Asia Pacific. So what I've seen is that if you look at the results across these countries, then New Zealand considers carbon emission and digital as third in priority. But when you look at safety, for example, then it's considered as its first priority. So we're harnessing a lot of digital resources towards resolving and addressing safety issues at the workplace. But when it comes to carbon emission, we haven't started the journey yet, at least from the enterprise side of things. It could be that we see that startups and small ventures are looking into that as an important area to invest in, but there is a lot of work that needs to be done at the enterprise side that it will be taken on as something that enterprise should adopt and should take as an important aspect as they're having, you know, conversations at the board of what we should be investing in terms of digital and sustainability. Now, if I can add one more insight from the study, which is quite intriguing, is we tend to do always kind of a comparison between us, New Zealand, and Australia. So how well we are doing as comparison with Australia. Unfortunately, we're not doing that well. Ooh. So on two aspects that we have sampled, one is the integration between the sustainability function and digital function within the enterprise. The Australians are far more integrated between sustainability and digital than New Zealand companies. So that's an indication that a conversation between the head of sustainability and the CDO are happening on a regular basis in Australia, whereas we didn't get to that point yet in New Zealand. So this needs to happen if we are to move towards that end of a solution that is driven by technology and solving carbon emission challenges. And the other aspect that we have noticed in our sample is that the way that budget within the organization is managed on sustainability is taken into account technology targets, okay? So carbon emission and other sustainability targets within the organization that are for the tech division or for the tech department are included in the overarching sustainability targets of the enterprise. This is what's happening in Australia. In New Zealand, it's still not there. So there is some sort of kind of fragmentation of the objectives and the targets within the organization, and tech doesn't still get their own sustainability targets and objectives well defined for the tech side. So this goes again towards, you know, the conversation that we have in here. Is it a pollution or is it the solution? Still on the pollution side, the tech is not well defined in terms of what they need to do. towards sustainability targets, and we need to move towards that end.
Yeah, very nice, because I do recall in Australia, there are a lot more stories coming out of how companies are approaching innovation to address, some of these challenges, and yet, in the last election or coming up to their election, there has been some commentary around the fact that there is a lack of commentary in this space. And in New Zealand as a country, we've committed to being carbon neutral by 2050. Perhaps for the audience, can anyone in the panel explain, what's the difference between carbon neutrality and being net zero?
I guess, I speak to this, probably you can as well, Elon. But so carbon neutrality is a case of you can keep doing what you're doing and you can buy offsets and call yourself carbon neutral. Net zero is that pathway of reduction down towards net zero, understanding that offsetting will make up a component of it, but the reductions need to be the primary focus.
Thanks, Dave. And so where is New Zealand currently when it comes to our net zero targets?
So we're there's two parts to New Zealand. One is we do have a very high national carbon footprint, and particularly we hide from our biogenic methane component of that because we're largely an exporting agriculture nation. So if we factor that into account, we're actually very, very high emitter of carbon. But all things start with a roadmap of where we are now and where we need to be by 2050. We're making good steps towards our reductions, and some of the policies that are coming out are heading in that direction without necessarily the tools to be able to execute yet. But certainly, New Zealand, like the UK as well, is kind of leading the way in this direction towards actually making tangible impacts, putting policies in place that support that, having a carbon budget that is quite aggressive, and our carbon reductions or carbon taxes for the emission trading scheme under TCFD reporting, they're pretty aggressive. We have good quality offsets in New Zealand that we can use that are more than just an accounting exercise. So the offset component that contributes to our balance sheet is, at the moment, probably market leading.
Very nice, very nice. Can you expand on that for us in relation to how the offsets work and perhaps some of the work that you're doing in this space?
Yeah, so there are a couple of ways that offsets work. One is that you have a pollution tax, and that may not necessarily take any carbon out of the atmosphere, and that's just under the emissions trading scheme. You pay a fee and you're allowed to emit. And every year organisations are targeted to reduce their emissions. And the balance, if you don't meet those targets, you're taxed by that amount. So now there's about, maybe it's $4.5 billion in that fund. The other thing that you can do, of course, is to buy offsets. And buying offsets can be in New Zealand from forestry, and we can do that from pine forestry, or we can do that from native reforestation. That's a big challenge because pine, we know, is subject to wildfire, and we don't want to see that carbon go back up in the atmosphere. It has a 750% higher likelihood of succumbing to forest fire with every 1 degree of climate change. So the challenge we have is if we're just paying taxes or just supporting pine forestry on its own, we're kicking the can down the road. So in 30 years' time, we have another problem to deal with. But there are opportunities to solve this using indigenous reforestation by investing in cleaner energies and other technologies that will get there. And I know the Air New Zealands of the world are desperately trying to capitalise on any of these advances with electrification of air travel and so on. New Zealand's with air travel is really disadvantaged because part of our big export is tourism, and we're the highest carbon footprint place to reach for most of the world. So our ecotourism and decarbonising the air industry is going to be really important for us. And I love the potential conversations going on around sustainable aviation fuel, which is where we grow fuel. So we're actually sequestering it from the atmosphere first before emitting it in the flights. So there's maybe 10 years down the track, there's quite a lot of opportunity for New Zealand if we keep pushing really hard in this direction.
Very nice, very nice. And look, you know, we've talked about blockchain, which is quite a new technology. Does anyone think whether that's helping or hindering carbon emission goals?
Yeah, so blockchain's a really good example actually of where it started with a solution. So around 13 years ago, a white paper came out that talked about a new way that we could decentralize an industry, and it grew from there. With Bitcoin, it uses a mechanism called proof of work, which requires computational power. Which can be quite energy hungry. But when you come up with like bleeding edge solutions, I feel like you push first for the solution. But over the last couple of years, we've realised actually there are other ways for us to achieve the same thing by using a different way of the consensus that actually pulls back on that. So we still get a great solution, but we've been able to adapt and change and evolve the way that happens within a blockchain so that it becomes, you know, more energy efficient.
Perhaps I could add to that. I think with blockchain and the different consensus mechanisms, proof of work can be a problem. You'll see a lot of sensationalist headlines about how much energy usage, for example, the Bitcoin network has. People say Bitcoin consumes as much energy as New Zealand. Now, consumption and pollution are two different issues, right? You do hear, and a big part of that is what type of energy is being produced, which is being used to do the computational mathematical problems, which secures the network, right? So if there are, and that I see it as largely a policy question, if there are laws in place and tax policies that promote sustainable, efficient, environmentally friendly forms of energy usage, then Bitcoin and proof of work systems will hunt those out. And similarly, if you are in an environment that allows dirty power to be used and that's cheap, then proof of work systems will hunt that out too. So I guess it depends on what value do you put on the product, the utility of Bitcoin. And, you know, if you're going to do a comparison like, well, Bitcoin uses as much power as Google, for example, or Netflix is securing a network that, you know, enables people to move digital property nearly instantaneously, a lot cheaper than the legacy system, maintain digital property that can't be confiscated. Is that a better use case than Netflix? You know, there's, it's a complex question.
I think it's really important for people to understand, and again, going back into debunking myths here, Bitcoin uses proof of work. We all know about Bitcoin. Bitcoin is not the only thing that uses a blockchain. In fact, there are a lot of other examples. Now, Bitcoin was a generation 1 blockchain using proof of work. There's only one other blockchain, Ethereum, that uses proof of work, and everyone else is using a different consensus mechanism, primarily proof of stake. Now, proof of stake, the transactions that happen on a proof of stake network would be the same as, that would take the same energy consumption as tweeting, sending an email. So I think I totally agree that there are people out there that are mining. In fact, at the start of this month, there was Gridshare announced that they were using hydropower to do Bitcoin mining in Southland. So there are people out there, Bitcoin is not going anywhere, there are people out there mining, and I feel like there is a movement towards sustainable power. But just knowing that the majority of blockchain networks that are being worked on today are actually moving to a proof of stake model that is actually the transactions, like I said, like sending a tweet, And you wouldn't think twice of doing that, would you? I guarantee you that there's been a number of tweets already posted for this session right here. That could be transactions on our network.
I think if I can add to that, that's a really important point there, Nicole. Using, proof of stake is less than 1% of the energy required for proof of work for the equivalent transaction. So we do have a lot of that stigma about the old world, which was very energy intensive, versus the new world, which is still energy intensive but much less. And coming back to that whole net zero thing, if we're using cleaner energy to generate that from a start point, perhaps that means not doing mining through peak hours when we're reliant on coal or gas coming in there. But secondly, blockchain is the future, right? It solves so many other problems, including your tracing of your scope 3 emissions, which we started the conversation talking about. Having all of those proof points from a supplier to the end product is going to be really critical for organisations to understand what is that scope 3 emissions. Do we import cement from somewhere else and call it carbon neutral because it's not included in the emissions scope, or do we actually get down to business and say, hey, look, we need to actually track this whole process and not treat carbon like an accounting exercise where we can play clever tricks to make ourselves look better?
Yes.
I think there's an economic, I see a lot of benefit in proof of stake as well, and Nicole's totally right. There's a lot of newer projects that are proof of stake based. Proof of work can have positive economic benefits as well. I mean, New Zealand has a high amount of sustainable forms of power. If the tax policy and the regulatory environment is right, then a lot of tax revenue can be generated from private companies who are doing proof of work mining, though that tax revenue can be invested into other sustainable forms of energy production or other things that benefit our community. And when what Bitcoin does is it can harness a lot of wasted energy as well, or stranded energy. So a lot of the time there will be, for example, wind or solar or hydroelectric, which is just not actually being delivered to the grid. It doesn't go anywhere. And that revenue could be generated by these private companies, but also in New Zealand, 3 of the 5 major companies are part owned by the government. So there is an opportunity for the government and New Zealand to be earning from clean, sustainable proof of work mining.
Certainly an opportunity I imagine the RBNZ will be looking at as they develop our first digital currency, which is a pretty exciting space to be in. But look, just for the audience, perhaps you could give us a breakdown of the differences between proof of work and proof of stake and what the benefits are.
Yeah, sure. So proof of work is exactly as it sounds. You needed to prove that you did the work in order to finalise a block on the blockchain. And that work came in the form of sophisticated maths equation, shall we say, that really could only be solved by a computer. And there's lots of nodes on the network, and they are all trying to solve the math problem to be able to finalise a block. The great thing about it is that someone solves it and the rest of the computers go, yeah, that's right, that's right, that's right, that's right, that's right. And that's how you achieve consensus, because you all agree that that block, and then it gets finalised. And it's the computational power of not just one of the nodes, but if you've got 100,000 nodes trying to do this work, then that's where it becomes quite energy inefficient. The move to proof of stake was around gamifying the ability to achieve consensus. So you would have the same number of nodes, and each of them would bid, if you like, their tokens to say we're going to help finalise these blocks. Now, in order to change the consensus, say you wanted to be a bad actor within that environment, and you were like, well, everyone else is going to say that, but I want it to say like this, maybe fraud or whatever. You would have to get 51% of those nodes to agree with you. And if you don't get that, if you go and say, I think it's 10, and you're all going to say it's 9, but I think it's 10, if everyone else says, well, we agree it's 9, then you get your stake slashed. So there is a financial incentive for you to validate blocks, but also if you become a bad actor and the rest of the nodes agree on that, then they will take your stake away. So it goes with an incentive and kind of slash system whereby people are putting money forward to stake and either getting a reward or getting that money taken away.
It certainly sounds like a more efficient way of working. Perhaps you can, or anyone in the panel can share some of the projects which are being built on this technology and how they're looking to support New Zealand's reduction in carbon emissions.
Nicole?
So SenseNet in itself is actually a proof of stake network. We work with CarbonClick actually on a number of projects, not only to provide a network that uses proof of stake, so taking the reduction in, but we also mint NFT carbon offsets for people on our network to use through CarbonClick.
Yeah, and probably that's the unique thing about that is the whole traceability back to the project, which can be proven through wrapping blockchain certification around those tons of carbon at a time. That's what brings that whole trust, transparency, and traceability element through from the trees in the ground through to and the legal requirement to protect those trees in the ground, all that documentation, right through to putting it on the United Nations registry, having it assigned there, and then even selling it back onto the Web3 space, whether that's by tokenizing or whether that's by taking it to those producing NFTs to help them to prove that they're carbon neutral for those for their own tokens. So
I totally threw Dave under the bus there. I was just like, and to you. Should really have explained a little bit more about what an NFT is. So within a blockchain environment, NFTs can be minted into blocks, and it basically provides with a hash that gives ownership to different wallets, right? What we've done is we've taken authentic, verified carbon offsets through CarbonClick and minted them in NFTs. So not only can you demonstrate, say you're a business, you can demonstrate that we have these offsets because it's on the blockchain, but you're actually, ownership of that offset is also recorded on the blockchain. So at SenseNet, not only have we offset all of our carbon for our network from its very beginning right up till now, we've actually even done future carbon offsets as well. So I think we're probably 20 or 30% into the future with our offsets. And if anyone ever wants to see it, then we can show them the transactions on the blockchain.
Super exciting. And when you said that, I sort of had a visual in my head of a new trading emissions scheme where you could trade futures in blockchain. Do you see that as a possibility to further New Zealand's goals in emissions reduction, or what are some other projects that are being worked on that you know about?
yeah, absolutely. So in the emissions trading scheme, you need to have a large project to qualify for the audit process, which certifies that you have X number of tonnes of carbon registered through the New Zealand ETS. Using blockchain, it's conceivable that those projects that either don't qualify or are uneconomic to qualify, i.e. much smaller projects, but amazing projects like there's million metres streams projects and things that are planting natives 6 metres either side of stream banks to connect biodiverse regions of our bush. Those things don't fall under the ETS, but they need funding and supporting. So this is a way of, we could use blockchain conceivably to approve those products or those projects and have them funded, have a carbon estimate which is based on multi-point of authenticity and authorisation. And that can be done far more cost effectively than an audit. And still in a trustworthy manner. So those are the kind of opportunities that we see to unlock huge potential in the smaller scale projects, which will actually dwarf the larger scale projects over the next decade.
Super interesting. So just bringing together some of the comments that you've mentioned, it provides more transparency at every step of the way, which feels to me like a lot more work's involved, and therefore I then think, is more effort involved, is more electricity involved, and how will that sort of help with carbon reduction?
I think it's a case of automation and making very efficient processes that are indisputable. They're processes that, because you're using a blockchain to guarantee them, there's no opportunity for fraud or corruption along the pathway to listing that ton of carbon. So in our case, yes, there's some energy consumption along the way, but if we're doing it in an energy efficient manner, so, talking about the proof of stake model, it's actually going to use a lot less energy overall than what's required to go in and assess, audit these projects. And the costs associated with that, the human power associated with that is you look at how much energy a human consumes to do a job. If this can be done on chain, it's actually saving a lot of energy in the long run and unlocking far lower costs to achieve those projects that otherwise wouldn't exist if we don't find a solution to fund them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You go.
Thanks. I think we're moving towards basically managing the problem, which is more kind of scientifically based approach. That's what we need, more of that. And the question is, in terms of actually offsetting, we probably got to the point that there isn't enough land to plant trees in order to reduce carbon emission. So the approach of doing that is by basically historically, this is how we thought about solving the problem, but I think that we are beyond the point where we actually will solve the problem. So we're trying basically to manage it and do it scientifically, so we can understand where there are those still gaps that we can reduce carbon emission and do that in a consistent manner. We are not going to be probably completely neutral, because by deploying technology, we are consuming and we are emitting. But we can gradually keep reducing this emission and keep an eye on how much we're actually consuming. And moving towards, say, renewable energy will probably help. This is one. And part of that, when we had that conversation about 5 minutes ago, what I was thinking about is, part of that is also influencing the board with clear message from customers and investors that this is the direction that the board should take. So it's all will come together as one big movement only if we have that pressure on the board by sending a very clear signal that it is about looking into how much you're emitting, it is about knowing how much your supplier is emitting. And without doing that, and this is exactly what Dave is talking about, without doing that, we are basically shooting in the dark. We don't know how much we have achieved, and we are going to keep basically doing the same thing of trying to plant trees, which is not necessarily going to solve the problem.
I was just going to talk about the transparency of the blockchain ledger, which is essentially a distributed ledger across a network of computers. It's open and transparent and auditable, and because of that, what's happening with transactions is they have what's called final settlement. So unlike, say, a Visa transaction where a centralised party will say that the transaction has been completed, in the background, that's not actually what's happening. Visa transactions take a lot longer to actually settle. So there can be fraud in the system where people have, stolen a credit card or something like that. Whereas on a blockchain ledger, there's final settlement. Final settlement occurs depending on how many nodes have verified the transaction. So when you have a reduction in fraud and transparency, that's actually has an economic benefit for I guess users around around the globe.
That's a really interesting point that you bring up there. I remember having a conversation a while ago. Someone was telling me about the Lightning Network. And from memory, what this was, when you have some quite intensive processes that you need to run, you actually take it off the blockchain and run it on your own systems until it gets resolved, and then you put it back on the blockchain for people to verify and validate. So just to your point there around it becoming more transparent and using that sort of Lightning technology, how can we ensure that transparency remains so that we can, have the trust in the system?
I'm not a computer science guy, I'm a lawyer, but difficult to answer that question.
Okay, anyone in the panel would like to comment on that?
I guess it's this, how I understand it would work is that these transactions are sort of grouped together, and but ultimately they are still verified by all the nodes in the network. So if you are having fraudulent transactions being entered, then they won't be accepted. The rest of the nodes who are undertaking this computational problem or staking their coins, they're not interested in validating invalid transactions, right? So, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that sounds perfect. Thank you. And look, Elon, back to your point, you mentioned that, shareholders should really be pushing for boards to become more socially responsible, to start measuring scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. And we sort of saw that a number of examples in the last sort of 12 months or so where, a number of large oil and gas companies had shareholders who were sort of revolting against their mandate, and they've been forced to start developing their own sustainability reports and planning to transition, which is really exciting. Do you think, these companies have an opportunity to use blockchain, and to what effect might they be able to use blockchain to help them with that transition?
Well, from the study that we did, the interesting bit about the study is that we didn't see that customers were having a voice in affecting the sustainability agenda within organizations across Asia Pacific. We did get a sample of an influence of the internal board and investors, but customers were not there. So that raises, first of all, a question whether people within the organization, at even middle managers, are they aware that the customers would like to see the organization taking more active approach towards sustainability? And it could be that middle management is not aware of that. And that's a problem. That means that the message from the board is not going down to middle managers to actually clearly state that we need to be more proactive towards sustainability. This is the first step. Investors is more straightforward, because investors, when investors shout, the board listens, right? It's very straightforward. So when you see investors and boards as the main two drivers to sustainability strategy, then you understand that the board reacts to investors, okay? Now, what kind of solutions they should take as an enterprise, then within the blockchain, obviously, scope, then there are quite a few solutions, and I guess traceability is very important. And I can see how blockchain as a platform can serve in different ways of increasing, the trust in doing our business in a sustainable manner. And I think there are very good examples here in New Zealand around sustainability in the primary sector, around food, and that perhaps you can share about what is done in that space. And that basically gives an indication that, the consumers at the very end of the value chain can get the signals that throughout, the value chain, there is traceability for each one of the acts that were taken with regards to how the food was sourced, how it was handled, and what kind of actions were taken along the way that will not jeopardize basically its sustainability position. What kind of solution? It's really hard for me to say because I'm not an expert in blockchain. So we've got Dave and Nicole here who perhaps can add more to that.
I think in the primary sector, of course, you've got that element of being an export nation. We need to be able to prove that from an animal welfare perspective and from an environmental perspective that our products are worthy of export. So you've got consumers in markets like the UK who are very sensitive to the sustainability of their food. They're moving away from red meats and so on, and which is the direction that we need to go in. But also there's a stigma that New Zealand being so far away, the freight and shipping emissions is going to hinder our ability to export into these markets. And that's a really important thing to address, is if we can prove the environmental impact of growing our food in New Zealand is much lower than an equivalent product that they've got from Australia, for example. Like a litre of milk in New Zealand has a much lower carbon footprint with our grass-fed animals than in Australia on average. If we can prove that and use blockchain as part of that mechanism to prove that, and also to add to that block what's the shipping and handling and processing carbon footprint, so that we've got a complete and transparent view of what that product means for the environment. This is where we can start to make advances in the world and play on the strengths that we have. The other thing is that we can leverage technology into that. For example, if we do have to, grow beef, for example, or dairy, are we bringing some of the new foods, seaweed or iodine-rich foods, into the mix, and can we prove that those cattle were fed that food, so therefore the emissions have been cut by, I think it's about 80%. That actually helps to deliver to a market that's asking for this, and it helps create that demand that drives more of the farmers to buy into this, which in turn reduces our 48% of our emissions are biogenic methane in New Zealand. If we can just address that, that's one example of the food industry in the primary sector, where blockchain can play a big part of driving that demand. Then we've cracked part of the solution to hitting net zero much, much sooner, which we need to, of course.
I'd just add to that, that interplay between boards and consumers, I guess that was kind of played out when Elon Musk put $1.5 billion US dollars of Bitcoin on Tesla's balance sheet. He was accepting payment for Teslas in Bitcoin, and but then that received a lot of backlash over concerns about the environmental unfriendliness or friendliness of Bitcoin, and I guess Bitcoin's global marketing department, doesn't have a CEO or a board of directors, but it's got all these people who believe in it. Yes, they came out as well and voiced their views on whether or not it is sustainable, what can happen. But Elon responded, and he stopped accepting payment of Bitcoin for Teslas until he was satisfied that there was not an environmental risk in terms of his shareholders who do have ESG concerns, right? So that's how I can see. I see there's a very important learning aspect and understanding aspect for boards, for directors. Elon obviously wanted to understand as well. He wanted to understand the arguments. Is this a good course for his company? Not all blockchains are created equal. Some are more secure than others. Bitcoin's never been hacked, versus others which have been hacked because they're just newer, they're not as decentralized. So there are different risks associated with each, and it could be a director liability issue, a professional liability issue for directors and advisors not to understand the technology.
Yeah, Elon Musk is a really interesting scenario. We have, from a reporting point of view, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, struggled to see where his operations as being sustainable and yet his promotion of Tesla is a great story, and it's helping everyone else be sustainable. So it'd be good to see when he can finally come out with that story that his own company is sustainable.
Even Dave and I were having this conversation the other day. You know, it takes carbon to be sustainable.
Yep.
Like you can't get around it, and they are trying to be more efficient with the way that they do it. But the reality is that there needs to be a certain amount of carbon to produce these things, right? So it's about making the balance within that. Or even in the case of blockchain, if I pull it back to that, yes, they came out with a solution that really had some legs, but maybe the first iteration of it wasn't as friendly as we would like, but has evolved seriously over the last 10 years to the point where it's actually looking really good now, comparable to other technologies similar to this.
Yeah, I think the proof of work and proof of stake can coexist. I think there will be certain businesses and governments that will favour proof of stake, and others who will see the benefit of proof of work, particularly if it's done in an environmentally sustainable way.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant, thank you. And lastly, I'd like to ask each one of you in one or two sentences where you think New Zealand should prioritise its activities in order to help us reduce our carbon emissions. Let's start with you, Dave.
Yeah, sure. So prioritisation for New Zealand's got to be in supporting those technologies in the agri and tourism sectors that help us to be a strong export nation, but also a leader to the rest of the world in how to do this. We've got the right platform and foundations to be able to leverage further. We've got the clean green image, which whether we deserve it or not, we've got that sound platform that the world's eyes are on us, looking for how to feed our populations for the next 100 years, how to do this in a way that doesn't stuff up our planet for the next generation. So yeah, that would be where I would see in agri and in tech. Part of the challenge with that is with clean energy. You know, it takes carbon to make a wind farm. It takes carbon to make a hydro farm. So we do need to look at where we can reduce, as with huge priority, where we can shift our diets with huge priority as well.
Thanks, Dave. And James, you?
Well, I'm not an environmental lawyer, RMA lawyer. I'm a banking and finance disputes lawyer. But I think it comes back to policies and tax. If we are promoting clean, net zero type policies and tax regimes, then blockchain, crypto will head towards that, and I think that's net beneficial to New Zealand.
Great. Elan?
I'll talk about it from the academic perspective, and that would mean, first of all, to understand more the problem. And I think that at this point in time, we do not understand the challenge that New Zealand is facing well enough. And one aspect that I raise is Scope 3. I think that there is a big gap there in terms of understanding of how much is emitted and how much has been done by New Zealand enterprise in order to solve that. And this is what we're intending to do at the Centre of Digital Enterprise. And the other thing is to start moving towards a solution in that end. And we're hoping to set up a digital sustainability forum where we'll bring in enterprises to talk about that. But I see a great role for Minister Shaw and Minister Clark to come together actually and talk with each other about the bridge between sustainability and digital, and start seeing part of the investment that goes from the government towards sustainability that will spill over to digital. And digital, as much as limited it is, think about sustainability. And I haven't seen that in the coming budget. We might hear more about that this afternoon, but I don't see that the bridge is there. So that's an opportunity perhaps for 2023.
It was. I don't know if you were able to hear the interview between Mike Hosking and Minister Shaw on that yesterday. It was an interesting discussion, and I think echoes your sentiment, Elan. Thank you. And Nicole?
All right, so I just swirled around about 40 things that I could have ended this with. Quite hard to pick one of them, actually. I feel like pushing forward with great technology solutions is extremely important because that's an advancement, and often the things that we are coming up with, like blockchain, are actually providing real world value. But I would like to see also the push for the pollution side or the reduction to come quite quickly after. And I think we have seen that as we discussed with the proof of work. They came up with an amazing solution, but quite quickly we've had to transition into something that is going to be more energy efficient. And when I say quickly, it's over the last 10 years. But don't stop the advancement of these ideas and technology. Just know that you need to start thinking about the reduction quite quickly.
Thank you very much. From the left, Nicole, Elan, James and Dave. Look, it's really exciting to see New Zealand companies innovate on the global stage, who believe that digital transformation is one of the keys to building a more economic, socially and environmental resilience. And look, purpose-led change combined with technology can help really transform our journey from intent to actually doing it. We'll be back shortly with our next event where Callaghan Innovation will showcase Aotearoa, Māori tech businesses that will protect our environment. See you soon.